Beneath the copper horizon, the desert stretched endlessly, a sea of dust and silence broken only by the restless wind. The evening light bled into the canyons, soft and mournful, as if the sky itself carried sorrow. From that vastness emerged a frail figure, an Apache widow of 23, her step uneven, one hand pressed against her side where pain gnawed each breath. Beside her trudged a small girl, no older than 6, thin as a reed, her dark eyes dulled with hunger, yet burning with a stubborn spark of survival. The mother's dress, once woven with care, now hung in tatters. Each gust of wind lifted its edges, exposing bruises and the fragility of flesh stretched too thin by hardship. Her lips moved in whispers, not to herself, but to the spirits she still believed lingered in the twilight. She prayed they would take her strength, if only her daughter might be spared. For 4 long days the child had tasted nothing but sips of brackish water. Every step they took was more a fall than a stride, each one promising collapse. The girl's tiny hand tugged her mother's, trembling. "Mama," she murmured, though her voice barely reached beyond cracked lips. The widow knelt, knees pressing into the dust, and held the child close. She stroked her daughter's hair, matted and tangled by wind, her own tears staining the girl's forehead. She wanted to say they would be safe soon, but the desert had taught her that hope without food was cruelty. Instead, she whispered the only truth her heart could hold. "You must keep walking, little star. If I cannot, you must." A shadow fell across them, long and deliberate, stretching over the parched earth like a banner of fate. The widow raised her gaze. Upon a dark horse sat a man broad-shouldered, his frame cut sharp against the dying light. His hat brim shadowed his face, yet his eyes were clear, steady, and impossibly calm. A 34-year-old cowboy, molded by sun and labor, carried himself with the unspoken weight of wealth and the authority of one who knew the land. He reined in his horse, studying the sight before him. A mother crumpled in the dirt, a child pressed to her chest, the embodiment of despair. Her pride stirred faintly, urging her to hide her brokenness, but her love for her daughter silenced pride. With trembling voice, she called up to him, "Stranger, I am finished. Leave me here. Take her. She has not eaten in 4 days. She can still be saved." The cowboy dismounted with unhurried grace, boots pressing deep into the soil. He knelt not as a rescuer, but as one who wished to see her face fully, the way light finds every flaw yet softens it. His silence was heavy, but not cruel. She reached for his hand, trying to place her daughter into it, yet her own strength failed, and she slumped forward. "I beg you," she whispered, her breath shallow. "Do not waste time on me. Save her." The man looked at the girl, then at the woman, then back again, as though they were not two but one life, bound inseparably. Without a word, he removed his coat, thick and lined, wrapping it around the shivering child. The girl clutched at the fabric as if it were warmth itself. Then, before the widow could protest, he lifted her into his arms, her body light as kindling yet heavy with the weight of her will to sacrifice. She struggled weakly, shaking her head. "No, leave me." His voice, when it finally broke the silence, was low, even and certain. "I will leave neither." The words fell like stones in water, sending ripples through the air. She wanted to argue, but her body, defeated, lay still against him. Her daughter, tucked safely against his chest, let out the faintest sigh, almost a whimper, that sounded too much like relief. The cowboy carried them to his horse. A ranch hand, riding back from tending cattle, caught sight of him burdened with woman and child. He slowed his horse, frowning. "You'll waste your strength, boss. There's no saving the broken." His voice carried that cold pragmatism the land so often bred. The cowboy ignored him, only tightening his grip around the widow, as though she might slip away if he dared loosen it. With one practiced motion, he mounted, balancing both mother and child before him, their fragile forms pressed against the steady thrum of his heart. The ranch hand shook his head, spurred his horse, and disappeared, leaving dust and doubt in his wake. Night descended by the time they reached his homestead. A lantern glowed from the porch, casting a warm halo onto the rough-hewn beams of the house. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke and bread baked earlier that day, faint but comforting. The widow had not known such shelter since childhood. He laid her gently upon a bed she felt unworthy to touch, the wool blanket coarse, yet softer than anything she'd known in months. The child, small and exhausted, was placed at her side with a bowl of stew pressed into her hands. She stared at it as if it were a dream, hesitant to take the first bite, then devoured each spoonful slowly, reverently, as if fearing it might vanish. The widow's eyes stung, not from smoke, but from the aching clash of relief and shame. Why would a man of means and strength trouble himself with her ruin? She turned her face into the pillow, her tears darkening the fabric. Across the room, the cowboy set aside his hat and sat in a chair near the hearth, the flames etching lines of quiet resolve into his face. He said little, only kept watch, as though guarding not merely their bodies, but their fragile chance at life. When at last the girl slept, the widow stirred weakly, her voice a ghost of itself. Why? He looked at her then, his gaze steady as the desert night. Because no one should be left behind. She closed her eyes, clinging to those words though she dared not believe them fully. In her heart lingered the fear that this shelter was only passing, that she and her child would awaken to find themselves abandoned once more. Yet, as the fire crackled and the house breathed with quiet warmth, she allowed a sliver of something dangerous to slip into her chest, something like hope. The cowboy leaned back in his chair, shadows crossing his face. His hand brushed the brim of his hat as though in thought, yet his eyes never left the mother and daughter. Outside, the wind howled across the plains, but inside, a fragile stillness grew. The widow drifted toward sleep, her last waking thought not of despair, but of a question. Would this man, against all reason, truly refuse to let her go? The days that followed unfolded with a quiet rhythm of survival, each morning rising like a hesitant promise. The widow, her body still tender from wounds and weariness, found herself slowly stitched back together by the steady care of the cowboy. His home, though modest, carried a strength she had never known. Its beams were thick, its hearth always burning, its walls unshaken by the storms that prowled across the plains. Within those walls, she discovered a kind of safety that was both comforting and frightening, for safety had always been fleeting in her world. Her daughter was the first to bloom beneath this new shelter. The child's cheeks, once hollow, began to fill with the roundness of life. Her laughter, timid at first, slipped into the corners of the house like birdsong after a long winter. She followed the cowboy as he worked, trailing behind him with wide-eyed devotion, watching his every swing of the axe, every careful tying of reins, as though he were some towering figure from a story. He never pushed her away. Instead, he taught her small things, how to pat a horse's neck gently, how to carry water without spilling. In those moments, the girl's spirit seemed to mend, thread by thread. The widow watched, her heart torn between gratitude and fear. She busied herself with small tasks, mending torn shirts, sweeping dust from the floorboards, stirring pots that simmered slowly over the fire. These gestures, humble as they were, felt like offerings. Still, a shadow lingered within her. She could not shake the belief that she was intruding upon a life not meant for her, that the kindness given so freely might one day vanish, leaving her bare once more. At night, when the child lay curled in blankets, the widow would sit near the fire, her face painted by flame and silence. The cowboy often sat across from her, the space between them thick with words unsaid. Sometimes she told him fragments of her past. She spoke of her husband, how he had been taken by violence before their child was even steady on her feet. She spoke of long journeys, of hunger and cold, of the nights she had prayed for strength she did not have. Her voice carried no bitterness, only the resignation of one who had endured too much for too long. He listened without interruption. His eyes reflected the firelight, steady and patient, like the earth itself hearing the story of rain. He offered little of his own past, only hints, a family gone, a ranch inherited, years spent carving out a place in silence. Yet she could sense the loneliness in him, heavy but contained, like a river dam too long. In their silences she felt something rare, a space where her wounds were neither hidden nor judged. Word spread quickly beyond the ranch. A widow and her child, Apache by blood, living under the roof of a wealthy cowboy. Such things were not easily ignored. One afternoon, a neighbor woman arrived, carrying a basket of dried beans. Her smile was sharp, her eyes darting between the widow and the cowboy with a curiosity she did not bother to mask. Later, when the widow stepped outside to fetch water, she overheard the whispers carried on the wind. Townsfolk said the cowboy could have his pick of women, strong and fair, yet he wasted himself on a half-starved widow with a child not his own. The words burned in her ears, searing deeper than hunger ever had. She carried the bucket back inside, her hands trembling, her heart heavy with the knowledge that others saw her presence as an unworthy stain upon his life. That night she lay awake, listening to the child's soft breathing, wrestling with thoughts she dared not speak. She had always known herself to be a burden, first to her family when she was widowed, then to the land when she wandered starving, and now perhaps to the very man who had saved her. She promised herself she would repay his kindness in every small way she could, though she feared no amount of work or gratitude could balance the weight she placed upon his shoulders. Yet life has ways of testing even the most fragile bonds. One evening, as a storm rolled across the plains, the child grew feverish. Her small body burned with heat, her breaths shallow and uneven. Panic gripped the widow, her heart clawing against her ribs. She knelt by her daughter's side, wringing cloths in cool water, whispering desperate prayers into the darkness. She felt herself drowning again in helplessness, the same abyss she had known when hunger hollowed them both. The cowboy did not hesitate. Without a word, he pulled on his coat, mounted his horse, and rode into the storm. Rain lashed the earth, wind tore at the trees, yet he pressed on, determined to fetch medicine from town. Hours passed. The widow sat clutching her child, every thunderclap a reminder of his peril. When at last the door creaked open, he stumbled inside, soaked through, shivering, his hands clutched tight around the parcel he had carried back. He laid the medicine on the table and swayed, his strength near spent. She caught him before he fell. For the first time, their roles reversed. Her arms became his shelter. She laid him near the fire, stripped the wet coat from his shoulders, and pressed blankets around him. Her hands, once trembling from weakness, moved with certainty now, fueled by a fierce gratitude. She sat through the night between them both, tending to fever and chill, watching over two lives that had somehow become her whole world. By morning, the child's fever broke. The cowboy stirred awake, his eyes weary but alive. She met his gaze with tears she could not hide. In that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, that neither was truly alone any longer. Still, doubt lingered in her heart like a stubborn ember. She wondered how long such peace could last before the world found a way to tear it apart. She feared the gossip, feared the whispers, feared the day he might decide the weight of her, and her child was more than even his strength could carry. As the days turned, the ranch settled again into its rhythm. The widow found herself humming softly as she worked, the child's laughter echoing through the rooms. The cowboy remained steady, a presence as constant as the horizon. Yet beneath the surface of this quiet life, a storm gathered in her soul. For one morning, as dawn spread pale across the land, she stood by the window, watching him saddle his horse. His silhouette against the sky was strong, unwavering, and within her a decision began to form, one born not of ingratitude, but of fear and love twisted together. She could not allow herself to become the chain that bound him, the burden others claimed she was. Her hands gripped the windowsill, her heart hammering with resolve. If she truly loved him for his kindness, perhaps the only way to honor it was to let him go. The decision came quietly, not in a rush of passion, but in the stillness before dawn, when the world was hushed and even the heart's secrets could be heard. The widow rose from her bed, her daughter nestled deep in sleep, unaware of the storm within her mother's chest. She packed little, only a thin blanket, a crust of bread, and the courage to do what she believed was right. Her fingers lingered on the wooden table, tracing the grain as though she might carve her gratitude into it. On a torn scrap of paper, she scrawled the words that tore at her. Asterisk, thank you for saving us. You deserve a life unburdened. I will not chain you to mine. Asterisk, the note trembled as she set it down, her hand shaking with each word's finality. The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth from the night's rain. She lifted her daughter gently, pressing a kiss to the child's temple, and stepped outside. The horizon glowed faintly with the first touch of sun. With each step away from the ranch, her chest grew heavier, as though the earth itself resisted her leaving. She told herself it was mercy, that love sometimes meant vanishing before it curdled into regret. Yet her eyes burned, for a piece of her already knew she was walking not toward freedom, but into exile. When the cowboy entered the kitchen that morning, he found the note waiting where her trembling hand had left it. His eyes moved across the words, slow and deliberate, his jaw tightening. He stood there alone while the silence of the room pressing against him. The chair she had mended, the child's small shoes by the hearth, the faint thread of her laughter still lingering in the air. Everything spoke of them, of the life that had begun to weave itself into his own. He folded the note carefully, tucking it into his pocket as though it were too sacred to abandon. Without hesitation, he gathered his reins and mounted his horse. The trail was not difficult to follow. She had tried to move quietly, but the land kept her secret poorly. Her footprints, light though they were, marked the damp soil, winding toward the riverbed. He pressed on, his heart pounding not with anger, but with the fear that she might truly vanish into the wilderness. The sun rose higher, heat spilling across the plains, yet he did not slow. Every hoofbeat was a vow unspoken. He would not lose them. By midday he saw them, two figures small against the vastness, the woman's steps faltering, the child stumbling beside her. The widow turned at the sound of hooves, her face pale, eyes brimming with both relief and dread. She gathered her daughter close, as though preparing for judgment. "You should not have followed," she said, her voice thin against the expanse of sky. He dismounted, walking toward her with the deliberate patience of one approaching a skittish horse. Dust clung to his boots, the sun carving hard lines across his face, yet his eyes were steady, softened by something deeper than resolve. He stopped just before her, lowering himself to one knee so his gaze met hers. The child clung to her mother's skirts, silent but watchful. "You left me a note," he said, his voice even. "But notes don't carry truth. Not the kind I need to hear." Her lips quivered, her hands tightening protectively around the girl. "I cannot be your burden. The world whispers already. They say I am unworthy of you, that you could have more, someone whole, someone who gives instead of takes." Her words broke into tears. "I will not bind you to my ruin." For a moment he was quiet, the wind tugging at the silence between them. Then he reached for her hand, rough palm against trembling fingers. "You asked me once to leave you behind. I could not then, and I cannot now. You are not a burden. You are the reason I come home." Her breath caught, the words piercing through the armor of shame she had worn so long. She searched his face for doubt, for hesitation, but found only truth etched deep as canyon stone. The child looked up at him then, her small voice breaking the fragile air. "Mama, can we stay?" The widow's strength crumbled. Tears slipped freely down her cheeks as she nodded, though fear still clung to her ribs. He rose, lifting the child gently into his arms before extending his hand to the mother. With reluctance, she placed her fingers in his, the warmth of his grasp anchoring her to a promise she had almost abandoned. Together, they turned back toward the ranch, the path behind them fading into memory. Life did not transform in a single moment, but slowly, like spring creeping across the land. The widow found herself moving with a new steadiness, her steps no longer shadowed by despair. She rose each morning with purpose, tending the fire, teaching her daughter letters she remembered, sewing garments from scraps. The cowboy worked as he always had, yet his evenings now ended not in silence, but in the quiet murmur of voices, the sound of laughter slipping into corners once claimed by emptiness. The townsfolk still whispered, their words curling like smoke in the air. Yet when they saw him walking through the market with the widow at his side and the child perched upon his shoulders, their gossip faltered against the weight of his quiet certainty. He did not explain himself, for his life spoke louder than defense. Seasons shifted, and with them, the rhythm of their days. One evening, as the sun poured gold across the fields, the child ran to him with shy excitement, clutching a flower in her tiny hand. She pressed it into his palm and whispered a word she had never spoken to him before. Asterisk father. Asterisk his breath caught, his eyes misting as he knelt to embrace her. The widow watched from the doorway, her heart swelling with a warmth she had thought forever lost. Love, she realized, had not arrived in grand declarations or fiery passion. It had come in quiet gestures, a bowl of stew shared, a fever tended, a hand refusing to let go. It was the kind of love that endured storms and silences, the kind that did not ask to be proven because it had already been lived. When he finally asked her to be his wife, there was no grandeur, only simplicity. They stood beneath the open sky. A few neighbors gathered, the wind carrying the vows across the fields. She wore a dress she had mended herself, her daughter clutching wildflowers as if they were treasures. His hand found hers, and in that touch she felt the world tilt into place. That night, as the fire crackled and the stars gathered above, the widow lay awake, listening to the steady breath of the man beside her and the soft sighs of her sleeping child. Once she had begged a stranger to leave her behind, believing her life unworthy of saving. Now she understood a truth too vast for words. Love is not measured by worthiness, but by the refusal to let go. She closed her eyes, her heart at last unburdened, yet deep within lingered a fragile wonder. If despair could transform into this, into family, into hope, what other miracles might the horizon still hold?